The modern world is loud, crowded, and endlessly demanding. When that pressure builds up, the natural instinct is to run in the opposite direction. We look for a place where the noise stops, where the notifications can't reach us, and where the distance from society promises absolute silence. That craving for isolation is exactly what drove a burnt-out worker to rent a remote cottage off the coast of Maine. It pushed an American structural engineer to secure a rare permit for an abandoned Japanese mining facility. And it convinced a group of restless college students to paddle kayaks through the dark waters of the East River at 2 in the morning. But to reach these places, they all had to cross the water. Look at this aerial view of these isolated landmasses. An island is a closed physical system. It is a finite amount of ground entirely bounded and restricted by deep ocean. Putting an ocean between you and the mainland does distance you from your everyday stress. But it also strips away your infrastructure. By intentionally removing yourself from the crowd, you are actively dismantling your own access to witnesses, to law enforcement, and to an immediate exit. You step into a geographical vacuum. The social contracts and safety nets we rely on simply stop at the shoreline. Out there, the only rules are the ones enforced by whoever happens to be standing on the dirt with you. We tend to mask this vulnerability with the illusion of control. We buy a ferry ticket and assume we can leave whenever we want. But schedule a single transport line connecting the mainland to your location and then abruptly remove it. The lifeline is severed and you are instantly stranded. The appeal of an abandoned island relies entirely on the assumption that it is empty. So what actually happens when you step onto what is supposed to be deserted ground and discover you are not alone? In that exact second, the geography flips. The water surrounding you stops acting as a protective moat to keep the world out and instantly becomes an inescapable wall locking you in. Consider the burnt-out worker who booked a suspiciously cheap single-room cottage on a tiny island off the coast of Maine. The island had barely any nighttime residents. Most people took the ferry out for the day and returned to the mainland before sunset. Once the last ferry pulls away, the environment undergoes a radical shift. The ambient noise fades out completely. There are no streetlights, no passing cars. By nightfall, the renter was left in complete silence, expecting to have the entire island to himself. But a few hours after he fell asleep, heavy boots began crunching on the gravel directly outside his thin walls. The footsteps stopped right at his front door. The intruder tested the handle, violently banged against the wood, and then spoke. He called the renter out by his specific first name. The intruder didn't live on the island, and he didn't take the public ferry. He bypassed mainland security entirely by navigating a small blue motorboat across the open water directly to that isolated dock at night. The renter's desire to vanish worked against him. The island's remote location didn't protect him from the people he was trying to avoid. It simply handed a human predator a quiet, undisturbed arena with a captive target. This dynamic shifts when the environment itself is actively collapsing. Through an academic contact, an American structural engineer secured a rare permit for Hashima Island, a dense, decaying concrete ruin off the coast of Nagasaki. Today, it's a silent, rotting ghost town. But during its peak as a coal mining operation, Hashima was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Thousands of workers and their families were packed tightly onto this tiny sliver of rock. Exploring the restricted residential blocks, the engineer noticed glaring anomalies. There was a clear, fresh path worn through decades of settled dust. In one room, he encountered an unfamiliar, unnatural smell and placed his hand against a concrete wall that was unexplainably warm to the touch. The decaying structure began to exhibit environmental hostility. When the engineer later found a makeshift bed and empty water bottles, he realized someone was living in the ruins. As he tried to escape, the crumbling architecture turned into a terrifying maze against him. His official guide, Takeshi, had been acting as a gatekeeper all day, speaking rapid, coded messages into his radio. When the engineer sprinted back down the hall to escape multiple sets of footsteps, he found the exit stairway deliberately blocked by a freshly piled mound of concrete rubble. Takeshi waited calmly by the only boat off the island, entirely unfazed by the engineer's panic. Hashima represents a trap where the decaying environment and local authorities actively conspired to turn the island into a sealed labyrinth. sometimes the structure doesn't need to physically trap you. The isolation is enough to break down your perception. North Brother Island sits in the East River, only half a mile from the Bronx. It houses the remains of a quarantine hospital, fully abandoned and reclaimed by decades of dense overgrowth. Despite being situated directly in the middle of New York City, the thick vegetation creates a profound sensory deprivation effect. The trees and brush swallow the environment, entirely blocking out the sight and sound of the surrounding metropolis. 3 college students illegally kayaked to the ruins at 2 in the morning. While exploring a pitch-black hospital corridor alone, one student heard his friend Jesse call his name from a dark room just a few doors down. He followed the voice and stepped inside. Sweeping his flashlight across the peeling walls, he didn't find his friend. Instead, the beam caught the edge of an impossibly tall, 6.5-foot figure standing dead still, facing the corner. The entity in the room had perfectly mimicked his friend's voice to lure him in. In enclosed, abandoned spaces where nature has completely swallowed human infrastructure, our own senses and minds can be weaponized against us. Surviving the trip didn't provide closure. The academic who arranged the Hashima permit, Dr. Yamamoto, suddenly became unreachable and seemed to vanish entirely. Between that disappearance, a stalker who knew unlisted rental schedules, and an impossible voice in the dark, the survivors were left with mysteries that have no rational answer. Escaping the physical island doesn't erase the psychological intrusion. The deep paranoia generated inside that isolated vacuum follows them home. Islands are isolated patches of land that operate as pressure cookers, enforcing absolute vulnerability. Stepping across the shoreline strips away every single safety net of civilization, leaving the visitor entirely exposed. The ultimate terror of an island comes from that absolute exposure. You are completely at the mercy of whoever decided to stay behind.